Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, we had the death of King George VI's brother George, and the confirmation of Princess Elizabeth, and then a gift of jewels that was left in a will for the Queen. So let's see what they're up to today. When the Queen got sick from bronchitis, she found it welcome in a way. It was a chance for her to rest in peace and quiet, and she read a lot during this time. She loved P.G. Wodehouse. It cheered her up, and she was such taken with Damon Runyon. Books had always been her companions. Other books she enjoyed during the war were Robert Louis Stevenson, William Beckford's Travels, and Heavenly Stories by F. Marion Crawford, a 19th century American author of adventure novels. She wrote to the king, "It's so terrible what the Germans are doing now in Europe. They seem to have lost every vestige of decent behavior. Their true nature is coming out, beast." Churchill and the King and the Queen knew that the United States was vital to them. When the King and Queen were in the United States, he invited the Roosevelts to visit Britain. The visit was fixed for the middle of October 1942, but the Queen, who was embarrassed, had to delay it because of her illness. And the Queen returned to London on October the 19th after recuperating in Scotland. The President's wife made the trip in secret on October 23rd. The Queen decided to let Mrs. Roosevelt stay in her bedroom. The King and Queen met her at Paddington Station and took her to tea at the palace with the princesses. Eleanor found Princess Elizabeth very attractive, quite serious, with a good deal of character. She asked a great deal of questions about life in the United States. Mrs. Roosevelt was far from demanding, but she was shocked by the conditions in which the Britons had to live, even in the palace. When she was shown her room, she observed the drafts, the lack of window panes, and the black line painted around the bath showing just how much water was allowed to be drawn. In her diary, she wrote that the palace was an enormous place and without heat. "I do not see how they keep the dampness out." That night, the King and the Queen gave a dinner for her, the Churchills, Lord Woolton, and the minister, who was the Minister of Food, General Smuts, and the Mountbattens were among the guests. Woolton told her that the food, fish cakes, cold chicken and ham with salad, and 2 vegetables, was much the same as would be found in any house in England, and would have shocked the King's grandfather. Mrs. Roosevelt didn't note, however, it was served on gold and silver plate. There was excitement at the palace because General Montgomery had that day launched at El Alamein the offensive that would eventually destroy German power in North Africa. Britain's first victory in 3 years of warfare was close at hand. The next day, the King and Queen took Mrs. Roosevelt to a lunch attended by heads of the British women's services and organizations. Conscription of women under 30 had been introduced at the end of 1941, and they were allowed to choose between the auxiliary services and industrial jobs. 90% of single women between the ages of 18 and 40 were now employed in industry, civil defenses, or the forces, and the corresponding figure for married women with children under 14 was no less than 76%. That afternoon, the King and Queen took Eleanor Roosevelt by car to see the St. Paul's Cathedral and many of the bomb-damaged areas of the city in the East End of London. Eleanor was stunned. London, she said, is flat for blocks. The most shocking thing of all for her were the countless homes that had been destroyed. The following day, Mrs. Roosevelt left the palace to take a tour of Britain, to visit American camps and airfields, and to see how the British were facing the hardship of war, which had factories bombed towns all over the country. And she talked to hundreds of people. She had a sense of the cold, of the shortages, of the blackouts, and the terrifying nearness of the enemy. She was struck by the English stoicism and enthusiasm, and by how everyone contributed to one goal victory. She found enormous gratitude for American help, and everyone was welcoming to American soldiers. Mrs. Roosevelt traveled a lot, and she visited Queen Mary at Badminton. Queen Mary said she liked her. She thought she was very nice and very intelligent. She said that Eleanor had a wonderful grasp of things and was impressed at what the British women were doing, and she thought it was a good thing that she came to see things for herself. The private secretary Lascelles said that the president's wife looks like she's a camel and is tough, but he liked her and saw dignity and even greatness in her. One thing that didn't go over well was that Mrs. Roosevelt tried and failed to persuade the Queen to grant an interview to a friend of hers who was also in London, Mrs. Bruce Gold of the American magazine Ladies' Home Journal. The Foreign Office supported the idea, but the Queen didn't want to. Tommy Lascelles wrote in his diary that Americans failed to recognize the unique position of the King and Queen. It would be no more appropriate for them to give interviews than it would be for the Pope to go to a race meeting or the President to a bawdy house. He thought the British public had no time for a chatty monarch, and that is why Edward VIII could never have made a good king. Once Mrs. Roosevelt got back to the White House, she gave a press conference. She said she was greatly impressed by the fact that there was only one thing in everyone's mind in Britain, that they were fighting a war, whereas in America there was much less pressure. She said standards of living have fallen for everyone. Eleanor said in Buckingham Palace they will not light a fire in the fireplace until December 1st. She thought the war was changing Britain fundamentally, and it would never be able to go back to the old system. The change is in the whole old social scale. Certain types of living will never be possible again. The people, she said, were working side by side, getting to know each other well, as they never did before, from all classes. She thought the length of the war still depended on how much Americans were prepared to sacrifice to help. The secretary sent a transcript of the press conference to the Queen, and she thought Mrs. Roosevelt had drawn a good and sober picture of this incredibly gallant country. Mrs. Roosevelt, she thought, had wisely understated the hardships and sacrifices because she didn't want to appear too pro-British. On Tuesday, November 3rd, the Prime Minister was due at the palace for his weekly lunchtime discussion with the King and Queen. Usually Churchill was never late, and the King was irritated. Eventually the Prime Minister arrived at the palace carrying before him a red dispatch box, and he walked towards the King, bowed, and made an announcement. He said, according to the King's diary, "I bring you victory." The Queen looked at the King, and he looked at her, and they thought, is he going mad? When the King looked into the dispatch box, he was overjoyed. It contained 2 top-secret intercepted Boniface radio signals from Rommel to Hitler. Rommel gave Hitler a very depressing account of the battle in Egypt from his point of view. He was greatly outnumbered by troops and tanks and armored vehicles. He was short of gas and ammunition in the front areas and in the rear areas. There was none of this that was very good news, and what rejoicing there would be. It was wondered if the Queen knew about the secret. Some doubt that she did, but the King took her into his confidence on almost every matter during the war. Later the Queen was asked if she shared the King's wartime burdens, and if he told her much, and she said, oh yes, he told her everything. She said it was only the 2 of them there, and they had to share information. She said they were discreet, and she still felt nervous talking about some things, even at that later time. November the 4th, the next day, the King got a telegram. General Alexander, Commander-in-Chief, Middle East, cabled Churchill that after 12 days of heavy and violent fighting, the 8th Army had inflicted a heavy defeat on Rommel's forces at El Alamein. Churchill had sent the telegram to the King, and he penned it in his diary, in which he wrote, "A victory at last, how good it is for the nerves." Tragedies were still happening now. That same day, the Queen had to send condolences to her friends, the Halifaxes in Washington. Their son Peter had been killed in the fighting in Egypt. Churchill warned against euphoria. He said, "It isn't the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of beginnings." Some rejoicing was called for, and the government ordered that church bells that had been silent since June 1940 be rung in celebration. In 1943, Stalin began to inflict serious defeats upon the Germans in Russia. Britain and America made more and more progress in North Africa. February 4th, General Alexander sent his celebrated telegram to the Prime Minister. "Sir," he wrote in caps, "the orders you gave me on August 15, 1942 have been fulfilled. His Majesty's enemies have been completely eliminated from Egypt, Cyrenaica, Libya, and Tripolitania. I now await your further instructions." The next instruction was to inflict total defeat on the Axis forces still in Africa. This was finally achieved with the surrender of the last remaining enemy troops on May 13, 1943. "It was an overwhelming victory," wrote the King. The Queen was a little concerned by the new optimism. She said, "I'm sure that this year is going to be a difficult one," she wrote to Osbert Sitwell, "because everyone is expecting so much. I am always a little alarmed when a series of optimism sweeps the country, though I have infinite trust in the level heads of the Britons who live in these islands." She was more concerned about the inevitable disagreements between Britain and her allies. She felt it was very important to keep together and work together to win the peace. Relationships among the Allies were changing, and not to Britain's advantage. It seemed the overwhelming might of America and the increasing power of Russia combined to diminish British influence among the big three. The Queen continued to visit places, people, and institutions involved in the war effort, often with the King and other times by herself. By the end of January, they visited aerodromes around Norwich, and they found it interesting that day. Much less formal than usual, the King said in his diary. As the Allies made progress in different theaters on the ground, the Luftwaffe attacks on Britain were stepped up again. The Queen was appalled. They were dropping bombs just anywhere. On February the 4th, 1943, she visited Lewisham Hospital to see the children who had survived an attack on a school, and she took them some bananas that Lord Louis Mountbatten had brought from Casablanca for her daughters. Seeing the children touched and horrified her. She said it made her all the more determined to beat these unspeakable Huns, to see their little faces so good and so hurt. For the sake of Nazi propaganda, I grind my teeth with rage, but it happens every day, pure murder. On another occasion, she recalled later, she met a woman in the East End leaning on what was left of her little gate. The house, in fact, had gone behind her, and she said to her, "We're not going to be done in by that there Hitler." I remember it quite vividly. In recent months, the Queen, like many others, had become more and more aware of the scale of Nazi evil. The German regime had since January 1942 quickened their attempt to liquidate all the Jews in Europe. The precise plans were secret, but Hitler publicly made his intentions clear. He had told a huge crowd of cheering supporters in Berlin that the result of the war would be the complete annihilation of the Jews. In October 1942, the Queen wrote to Queen Mary, "Is it not terrible the way the Germans are behaving all over Europe? The mask is off at last, and the true savagery is emerging." Radio was an important weapon of the war. The BBC was used most effectively by Churchill, whose ringing invocations of spirit of victory were vital to the nation's morale. Broadcasts by the King and Queen were more rare, but they too played a crucial role in sustaining the conviction that the nation was united around a just and essential cause. Neither of them took it lightly, the King because of his stammer, the Queen because she found the writing of any broadcast something of an ordeal. Tommy LaSalle said that the Queen had a great dislike of being what she called turned on like a tap. She demanded time for preparation and reflection before making any sort of public utterance. In early 1943, she agreed to broadcast again to the women of the Empire and agonized over what to say. The Queen was a conservative and didn't want the war to revolutionize women or to revolutionize anything. She wrote to Alec Hardenridge, "One would like to congratulate women on the way they are tackling men's jobs, and yet they must be ready to stand down and after the war." She sought the help of her spiritual advisor, the Bishop of Lichfield, but the week before the broadcast she wasn't happy with the speech and showed it to the private secretary, asking him to do something, however drastic, to give it a little punch. He said that the draft was poor and set up till 2 a.m., and he wrote another 3 pages, which he then returned to the Queen. And she adapted and adopted some of his ideas, and then she sent the new version to Churchill, who made his own suggestions, which she liked. In the final version, which was broadcast on April 11, 1943, she started by saying that she wanted to talk, and it would be a meeting between herself and her fellow countrywomen all over the world. She didn't have a special message, but there was something deep in her heart that she knew that they should be told, and probably I'm the best person to do it, she had said. She said that women might feel she was exaggerating and asked what they had done compared with what men endured dodging submarines or chasing Rommel across Africa. The Queen said that women's work was just as valuable, just as much war work as that done by the bravest soldier, sailor, or airman who actually meets the enemy in battle. She said that they had met the enemy too, endured his bombs, and you have helped put out the fires he has kindled in their home, and she told them they have tended those he has maimed, brought strength to those he had bereaved in 100 ways. You have filled the places of the men who have gone away to fight, and coping uncomplainingly with all the tedious difficulties of wartime, you have kept their homes for them against the blessed day when they came back. The secretary said in his diary the Queen delivered her broadcast and did so very well. In its final form, it was the joint work of Winston Churchill, the Bishop of Lichfield himself, and the Queen, a curious trio of collaboralists who were unlikely ever to be in literary partnership again. Nevertheless, its sentiments were the Queen's own. Churchill told the Queen that the broadcast was an outstanding success. He told her voice was clear and captivating, and he heard from every side nothing but praise and expressions of pleasure and high sentiment. And she got a lot of letters of congratulations. They took comfort in her words. She tried to wear the praise lightly. Her brother David wanted her to speak to a women's Christian group, and she told him, "Honestly, darling, I don't feel very holy at the moment, and couldn't think of a word to say to them. Just because I said I believed in Christianity and home life, I am considered practically a mother superior, and clergymen raise their hats to me with a sort of special gusto." I will end the video here, and in this video we saw that the Queen had a love of books, and it helped to keep her at peace while she was feeling sick and stressed out over the war. I liked the visit of Eleanor Roosevelt to Britain. It was neat to hear her view of what Britain was going through at that time. It was also great to hear the news of defeat of the Germans in Egypt, the first great news England had at that time, and the news in 1943 when another victory came when the Germans were driven out of Africa. The Queen was getting upset with how the Germans were so hateful and trying to destroy everything in their path, and then when they decided to do away with all the Jewish people in Europe, that was too much. The King and Queen kept giving speeches to keep the morale up for the people of Britain, and it really did keep the spirits of the people up. The Queen made a special speech for the women of the United Kingdom, and it was special, coming from the heart, and with the help of the Bishop of Lichfield, Churchill, and her private secretary, as well as herself. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it will help my channel to keep growing. And check out the description area of my video. I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that you might be interested in. If you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. If you purchase it, I get a small commission that's of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everybody a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.